Welcome to the Exploring Climate Solutions webinar series. This series is brought to you by the Governor's Council on Climate Change. On April 22nd, 2015, Governor Malloy issued an executive order creating the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3. The Council is charged with examining the efficacy of existing policies and regulations designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and identify new strategies to meet the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. The Council is composed of 15 members from state agencies, quasi-state agencies, businesses, and nonprofits. To learn more about the GC3, please go to www.ct.gov/deep/GC3. The webinar series explores innovative and successful climate change solutions in Connecticut and the nation. The series provides firsthand accounts of high-profile municipal climate programs, climate initiatives in the corporate world, new greenhouse gas reporting frameworks, statewide sustainability programs, low-carbon fuel initiatives, and other programs and projects that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve climate resilience. Today, we're excited to have Jessica Bacher and Joshua Galperin, principal collaborators at the Land Use Collaborative. Jessica is the Executive Director of the Land Use Law Center at Pace University School of Law, and Josh is lecturer at the Yale School and School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Their presentation today will focus on the critical role land use planning and regulation plays in state and federal efforts to mitigate climate change. The presentation will be about 40 minutes long, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please submit your question in the question dialog box, and we'll read it aloud for Jessica and Josh to respond to. And before we get started, for those of you listening via your computer speakers, if you're experiencing poor sound quality, I do encourage you to call in using your landline. So Jessica and Josh, thanks for your willingness to present today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to start.
Great. Thanks for inviting us, Carrie. I, for one, am glad to do this, and I'm glad to be able to start off the presentation. What I want to focus on today is, as the title here suggests, is bottom-up climate change action. But I think not so much about what bottom-up climate change action or governance is, but rather about the role that bottom-up governance can play in the state, national, and even the international arena. And the reason I want to focus, and I think we think that bottom-up governance is important in general, is because we're at a crossroads today. You know, international and national leaders are taking bottom-up governance much more seriously than they ever have before. And that means that state and local governments are in a better position than ever to capitalize on, or to develop, if they haven't already, proactive approaches to climate change. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start with a sort of a general overview, and then Jessica is going to get a little more into the weeds. Okay, there we go. So traditional climate change governance, which I want to just describe very briefly, it relies entirely or almost entirely on national and international actors. So where traditional environmental governance does incorporate local actors, it generally treats them as tools rather than as partners, collaborators, or even as leaders. And the new construction that we want to promote and that we want to talk about today is one in which local government is more than a tool. It's a leader, a partner, and perhaps most importantly, it's a laboratory for climate change solutions. So the real distinction here, or the real paradigm shift that we want to focus on, is that we aren't just asking national, international, even state-level leaders to find ways to solve local problems. We're asking these leaders to think about the ways that local governments can come up with their own solutions, their own ways to solve problems, and then integrating those solutions into sort of top-down governance. So let me go through a short history of the role of this sort of bottom-up local action in top-down, mostly international thinking, so that I can show more where things both stand today, the trajectory that we're on, and so that there's more of a sort of a basis to understand some of the specific stories that Jessica's going to dig into. So let's see here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the United Nations Habitat and Human Settlement Foundation, which became known as the United Nations Habitat and Human Settlements Program and is more commonly just called Habitat, is one of the early examples of the way that international leaders, international organizations began to think about local leadership, local governments. So in 1975, Habitat emerged to address the problem of, quote, the rapid and often uncontrolled growth of cities. So this was a problem that international leaders realized could have environmental consequences, and they wanted to address it. So the Habitat 1 action plan, as it was called, sought to control the environmental damage of cities. Now, obviously, this is sort of a first foray into international leaders considering local issues, but it's not what I would now call bottom-up governance, because what it does is it highlights sort of first-stage local considerations of the problems that local settlements can cause and that local governments can face, but not with a lot of respect towards the roles that local leaders should play in addressing those problems. By 1996, Habitat 2 began to demonstrate a slight change in this kind of thinking. So on the one hand, Habitat 2 sought to, quote, assess the country's progress in achieving sustainable development and tackling urbanization within their cities. And what you can see here is the primary focus is still on top-down national level control over the cities, local governments, that is, within countries. On the other hand, Habitat 2 did begin to consider a push for decentralized systems, for more, quote, power devolved to local municipalities and authorities because they are better equipped to respond to rapid changes. So while this still presumes that cities are problems that need correcting, it explicitly recognizes that cities are well equipped to govern their affairs and improve whatever conditions need improvement. It isn't just left to national and international leaders. And even more recently, Habitat has dedicated significant time to addressing the local government and climate change intersection. So the 2015 climate change strategy from UN Habitat notes that, quote, international actors increasingly are recognizing the urban and local government dimensions of climate change. And that same report specifically identified land use planning and design, which are both traditionally local responsibilities, as bottom-up strategies that could lead to positive climate benefits. So this is the two-way street, or the bottom-up governance, that we want to focus on today. It's an international or a national body or even a state government paying attention to local tools and designing guidance and planning based on local government's ability not only to minimize the bad, but to maximize the good. So this is the process of learning what works based on local experimentation, rather than and then replicating that experimentation, those successes, in multiple places. Another part of international space where you can see this local focus, this bottom-up role gaining importance, is in the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs as they're often called, are a UN initiative to set measurable goals for transforming the planet to a more sustainable one by 2030. There are 18 goals with 169 specific targets, which is pretty incredible and a little bit unwieldy. And the idea here is that they're going to replace the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs, which were similar goals but for the turn of the last century. So now we're looking forward. And as you can see here, SDG 11, which says make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, it's focused on local government, sustainable cities, and communities. So the world community recognizes that more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas, and that number is growing. So obviously, we can't achieve sustainability and a sustainable future without making the single largest type of human settlement sustainable. And while cities are the primary focus here, it's the idea that local governments have to have a role in governing their own future sustainability. Now, I said earlier that climate change is one of the key areas, the key intersections here. Of course, the SDGs do consider climate change, and as you could see from the sort of the trajectory in the habitat action planning, that urban intersection really gave rise to local consideration when climate change became an important consideration. It's one area where the value of bottom-up action has been getting particular recognition, no doubt because the severity and complexity of the problem of climate change means we have to rely on as many leaders, as many ideas as we possibly can. Inclusiveness is obviously a good idea here. So the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change explicitly acknowledges the role and authority of multiple levels of government, including local governments and the rights of local communities. As they say, quote, parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider local communities. This is right out of the 2015 Climate Change Agreement. One of the other things that you are probably familiar with that came from that process is the intended nationally determined contributions, which are contributions that each nation agrees to make in order to help mitigate climate change. And the very nature of these intended nationally determined contributions makes room for bottom-up action for local leadership like we haven't seen before. So these are obviously, quote, nationally determined, and that implies a national leadership here, which is accurate, but it does allow different countries to determine their contributions differently. And in many cases, that national determination is based on significant contributions from local leadership, from local governments. So just by letting nations decide, rather than deciding, for example, at the international level, the Paris Agreement implicitly makes room for local bottom-up governance. A couple more quick examples. I had the privilege of being part of this Yale climate change dialogue, which really focused on the idea of nationally determined in the climate change negotiations. So the climate change dialogue saw the national focus as a very traditional part of international agreements, of any international climate change agreement, but not necessarily as the most productive part of the agreements, or the agreements we've been working towards in the past. So the climate change dialogue urged that cities, businesses, and other sub- or non-national actors should be able to sign the Paris Climate Change Agreement just like national governments could sign it. And this, I think, seems pretty radical, especially to folks who have been involved in the international space for a long time. It actually isn't as radical as it seems, because areas like human rights and labor have had opportunities for non- or subnational actors to sign on to agreements. Nevertheless, this probably was a little too radical for the climate change negotiators, because it did not become part of the 2015 Paris Agreement, but it was the kind of conversation that led to some pretty amazing commitments from non-national actors and subnational actors in the lead up to and after the 2015 Paris Agreement. So Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Mayor Anne Hidalgo of Paris, who you see here, they hosted a summit for local leaders on December 4th of 2015 as part of the Paris climate change negotiations. And as a result of that summit, they had a number of actors sign the Paris City Hall Declaration. So this is a declaration which reiterated that local leaders understand the huge importance of acting on climate change, and acting on climate change immediately, and it committed the signatories to use their local authorities to act in a number of specific ways. And it wasn't just government actors that were part of this. There were groups such as C40 Cities for Climate Action, which includes megacities, and ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, which some of you're probably familiar with both of these, which includes all nature of local jurisdictions. And these organizations are in themselves demonstrations of the building momentum and effectiveness of bottom-up leadership that we haven't seen in the past, and that the unfortunate situation of climate change is creating new space for. So where organizations like these are providing an advocacy service at the international level, we, that is Jessica and I and our collaborators, we recognize a real need for similar activities on a more local scale. So that's why we've come together to launch a new project, which you can see the logo here, we're calling the Land Use Collaborative. And we not only have a local focus, but we're a hybrid of academia and professional services, so giving an opportunity to both support the efforts of local governments in the region, and also, which is really important to us, to train the next generation of environmental leaders, that is, the students that we work with on a daily basis. So the Land Use Collaborative, it's a collaboration between academics, students, planners, lawyers, and others to promote sustainable land use policies. And we support and train local land use leaders, provide student opportunities, connect experts, and empower municipalities to carry out cutting-edge sustainable land use policies that can then make them bottom-up climate change leaders. So you all know, no doubt, that these local processes can be harrowing and divisive, but they're also so important to engendering community values and making decisions that then have public buy-in, as long as they're done right. So this local government model is one model that the Haub Law School's Land Use Law Center, which Jessica is a part of, has been carrying out for decades. They've worked in New York State's lower Hudson Valley to provide research, training, technical assistance, support, and strategic planning services to that region's communities. And what we're now trying to do through the Land Use Collaborative is replicate this success in the state of Connecticut. So as I've sort of implied, we work with trained students so that the Land Use Collaborative can quickly, affordably, and effectively develop techniques to remedy all types of land use problems that afflict urban, suburban, and rural communities. And as I've said, we do all of this by working in partnership with local land use leaders, experts of various stripes, academics, professionals, and other change agents. And in the end, it's important to reiterate that this is not a matter, none of this local government leadership, this bottom-up focus, is a matter of telling others what to do. Rather, it's a matter of telling them and helping them understand what they can do. And one thing they can do is be leaders in climate change mitigation. So we want to facilitate that, and that's more of what Jessica is going to talk about now. So Jessica, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Good afternoon, everybody. With a webinar, it's hard to see what everybody's doing or be able to tell jokes, so I'll avoid telling bad jokes. I don't know if there's silence or anybody's laughing, so we'll just get right into it. So I think that what Josh just went over to me in the role that I play at the Land Use Law Center with the Land Use Collaborative is really a kudos to local government. It's telling them that not only does the state or the federal government recognize that local governments have been innovative and can be leaders in climate change action, that they really are an opportunity. And in places like the United States, where we have a decentralized government, where local governments play a significant role and have a significant amount of authority to do that, we really have an opportunity. And that opportunity is important, and it's a good time to look to the international focus and provide local governments with the resources they need in order to advance mitigating and adapting to climate change issues. So one of the big things that we focus on is the diffusion of innovation, and local governments, from the work that we've done and research we've done, most likely respond to issues when there's a comfort level with the types of strategies they can use. And that often is connected directly to best practices and learning about best practices. And the closer to home those best practices derive from, the more likely that they will be adapted by neighbors and replicated. So one of the focus areas that we often are working is by collecting and evaluating local strategies and looking at how communities that we work with can use those strategies to address climate change. Specifically, we do have a resource called the Gaining Ground Database, where we house a lot of these local examples. So if you're ever looking for example laws, it's a great place to look. If you just Google Gaining Ground Database and Land Use Law Center, it will come up. So what I'm going to do is focus on looking at 4 buckets of strategies that local governments can look to address climate change from a bottom-up approach. And so the first area will be transit-oriented development. Then we'll take a look at green buildings or energy-efficient buildings, so building from the neighborhood scale to the individual buildings. What can local governments do? To the vegetative carbon sequestration, how can local governments play a role in open space and preservation of our green spaces? And then finally, in siting and addressing renewable energy. So if we take those 4 buckets, those are really the areas that we've seen the most activity for local governments from a land use perspective in addressing climate change. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is looking at some examples from other countries and then also examples from the United States, and just kind of showing you in the few minutes that we have the range of options. And we found that they really fall into 3 categories. Local governments as actors in this area are usually either doing something from a planning standpoint, where they're providing goals and guidance and objectives, or that they're creating some type of regulatory framework where they can mandate or incentivize through that framework the goals that they're trying to meet, or finally creating financial mechanisms or direct incentives such as tax rebates and things like that to advance these types of goals. So again, we're going to look at transit-oriented development, green building and energy-efficient building, sequestration and renewable energy as groups, looking at international examples and national examples in those 3 categories of planning, zoning, and incentives. So if we look first at transit-oriented development, I think this is the area that is...
Jessica, can I interrupt for a second? This is Josh. Should I be on some different slide?
Yes, sorry, Josh.
That's okay.
Go ahead and move forward to the COD slide.
Okay.
There you go. Here
we are.
That was only one. So transit-oriented development, transit-friendly design is a broadly used term that includes a range of development and planning initiatives generally aimed at facilitating the use of public transport within a community or municipality. There are a number of factors that are really important to really have transit-oriented development. It's not just putting development close to transit. It's orienting that transit with that development, having a mixture of uses and design elements that are connected to ridership and decreasing vehicle miles traveled through those design elements. And so getting all of those pieces together is a centerpiece of what planners do and designers do in making that happen. And so if we're looking at a neighborhood scale and we're looking towards programs like LEAD for Neighborhood Development, these are the goals we're trying to achieve, and local governments are, you know, right in the middle of making that happen through the decisions they make in their plans and zoning decisions, as well as incentivizing these types of programs. So transit-oriented development can lead to a significant decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, which is produced through transportation, resulting in mitigation. The U.S. and globally, transportation contributes 27% of the final energy use, and globally the sector contributes 6.7 gigatons of CO2. So the transportation sector and addressing it through land use patterns and human settlement patterns is a key target for local governments in the actions and decisions that they make. It also has effects on air quality, long-term traffic congestion, and other livability issues in that area. The thing that makes this so ripe for action is that it's not only a mitigation tool that local governments can control, it also is in demand by the market. So to have ideas about how we should build, well, we can have goals and plans that outline those things, but without support from the market and being driven by market demand, we're not really going to have developers or financing to build those projects. And so there are a lot of studies that have come out recently, especially from Smart Growth America, that have documented that the real estate market in transit-oriented walkable areas has come back much quicker and much stronger and has significant premiums in value and rental market. And so there is a demand, and with our changing demographics, that demand is likely to continue. So our urban environments, but also in our suburban environments, creating walkable transit-oriented development is possible. And some of the best case studies come out of places like Washington, D.C., where a lot of these desirable types of neighborhoods have been built in the suburban areas outside of D.C. as well. So if you're from a community that is not, you know, urban, there's also opportunity there. So some other just key things to make these projects successful is, you know, for people to use transit, the duration of time and what types of uses are at the end, so employment being at the other end of the transit, as well as those walkability and design factors. So next slide, we're going to take a look at the international examples. So this is not anything that's new, and I think two of the interesting things on here is the Fingers Plan from Copenhagen. If any of you have traveled there, you might have been able to see that when you looked at the map. And then also the example on the page from China. The example from China is a financing example where it links together the developer of new transit with the development of the land use development project itself to try to share the premiums of the land and therefore help to spread the financing of the project between the two. So we don't see that in the United States, but it's an interesting concept. If we look at the next slide, you'll see what the Finger Plan looks like. And as you could guess, it's a plan that follows these transit corridors where they're putting development in those areas. I think one of the interesting things about this example is that it dates back to 1947, where they've continued to build that out in that direction. Unlike a lot of the development plans between, you know, that time period today, especially if we look at United States examples, we don't have that continuing pattern of development. We had suburban development, 1 acre zoning, you know, the typical American dream, which is now shifting to this type of, you know, preference for more urban living close to transit. So kind of looking at, you know, what's happening in older cities across, you know, the globe in comparison to the U.S., it's interesting to see how they've continued that development pattern through the decades. So the next slide, we have some examples from the United States. Several of them you'll see are from New Jersey. You'll see the obvious ones like Portland or Seattle, but these are all examples, again, of planning, zoning, or incentive-based initiatives that help to direct development towards transit-oriented development. So, you know, these plans, you're probably asking why so much from New Jersey. There was a big push in New Jersey to coordinate planning around the train stations with updates to the zoning as well. So you'll see, you know, a lot of examples of helpful planning and zoning language coming out of New Jersey as well. And then we have an example out of Connecticut on that slide as well. So a lot of activity, and as Josh said, that we're recognized in the global conversation is that we have action at the local level, not just in the United States, you know, across the globe, and it's an innovation and an approach that we can draw on, and people that are working in this sector can continue to draw on and serve as models for other levels of government. And we'll see some of that happening in these other examples. So the next area, after looking kind of at the neighborhood scale planning, to go to the next slide, we'll start to look more at the individual buildings and the role local governments can play in the individual buildings. So, you know, in the U.S., we do have building codes that control a lot of the way that buildings are actually developed, but there's a lot of opportunity to go beyond those codes when allowed within the legal system to add additional requirements for energy efficiency as well. And it's been recognized that buildings like transportation really serve an important role when we're looking at mitigation. There's a lot of opportunity to decrease CO2 emissions when we look at buildings specifically. And again, local governments through land use have played an important role, but not just with energy. I mean, climate change and energy, but also the built environment and the other types of issues we're facing, you know, through a more broader green building approach can be addressed by local governments. And that includes addressing stormwater runoff, water use, material use, waste from these buildings as well, are all types of programs that we've seen local governments, you know, create innovative strategies to address these types of concerns. On the next slide, we'll see a listing of examples that address buildings from across, you know, in other countries. The example out of Italy is a municipal code. So at the time, Italy did not have a municipal code, and so a small town, you know, decided it would be important, and then that was adapted and replicated by several other Italian municipalities. And so that's the interesting and exciting thing about activity and action at the local level, is that it can spread. If one community can show something can work, neighbors will pick that up and look to replicate it. So it creates this diffusion of innovation that I mentioned, and really the focus of a lot of the work that we do is sharing best practices so that, you know, other communities can see how they work. Look over and say, who's going to go first? And so trying to get, you know, something implemented, that's where technical assistance may be extremely important. And then once that's in place, working through those implementation issues that we can see it picked up and continued in other areas. So you can see here there's, again, a mixture of planning, regulation, and tax incentive-based programming coming out of these local jurisdictions directed at the individual buildings themselves. So kind of, you know, building on that, you know, idea of the neighborhood and what the municipality controls at that scale, then up to the individual buildings. The next slide will show us, I just advance our U.S. examples, and I think, you know, right at the top is probably one that most people can, you know, look to for, you know, a lot of examples coming out of Boulder, Colorado. I mean, there's certain municipalities that really, I think, have created a name for themselves nationally as being a go-to because they have the political will and the resources to be a little bit more innovative than maybe the average local government. And so they can test a lot of these different concepts and figure out how to make them work. But then once they do, other communities are more likely to pick them up, and we've seen that, especially in this green building program development area, where the City of Boulder really created their own local green building program, and they have, very advanced mandates where we see other communities, maybe using an incentive-based program, like you can see the fee schedule example has North Carolina at the bottom, where you're just trying to decrease some of the costs of a green building so that you can kind of try to offset if there's additive costs of that type of requirement. So, the range of planning for it, encouraging it to, highly developed mandates, such as we see out of Boulder, to simpler things where we just incentivize it through waivers of fees or decrease in fees. We've also seen a lot of local governments just use their, permitting and zoning process to incentivize the adoption of goals that you're looking for. So particularly the focus on, streamlining the process. So if you're doing a larger development, you're paying professionals, and so every day that you're going through a process and the outcome is maybe not predictable, it also risks your financing. And so, programs that incentivize just through the, streamlining the approval process actually have achieved a lot of goals in the area of green building and even in the areas of kind of neighborhood scale redevelopment as well. So again, looking to the full range of tools, if the political will isn't there for a more progressive mandate, making sure that you at least start with some planning language, as we see coming out of a lot of climate action plans and sustainability plans, or incorporated into, more basic land use plans, to incentivizing, through easier, low-hanging fruit types of things like streamlining. So they go to the next slide. I'm seeing a comment to repeat the name of the database. The database is the Gaining Ground database. If you just Google the Gaining Ground database, you will find it on the Land Use Law Center's website. And I think everyone's seeing the slides now. Okay, so sorry to get distracted by the questions, just to make sure everything's going okay as I'm in my bubble here. So the next area is looking at the vegetative carbon sequestration. So from a land use perspective, if local governments are controlling where we develop, there's also the control to decide where we are not developing. And so the transition of developing our open spaces is a huge loss to our sequestering environment. And so it's a very important area from the standpoint of climate change, because even if we decrease CO2 emissions, that's very important, but we also need to maintain our sequestering environment. And so these often fall into the categories of preservation of open space, protection and conservation of agricultural lands, forest areas, or protecting natural resources through green infrastructure. So protecting open spaces outside of the areas that we're targeting for development in a significant way for urban environments, but also inclusion of green spaces you see by the two pictures here within our built environment. So local governments can address both, so depending on where the community is. They may be dealing more with the open space, larger scale conservation issues, sequestering environments, versus incorporating it into the community itself. And that could be done, for purposes of climate change mitigation in response to adaptation issues like heat island impact. But it's also really important for things that local governments are dealing with, such as stormwater runoff. And there's a lot of opportunity to do that as well. So if we go to the next slide, we can see some examples from an international context. So again, you'll see on this list a mixture of strategies addressing this sequestering environment from the standpoint of more larger scale open space preservation, like the Australia example. So the hill space zone is adjacent to the built environment, the urban area, but it's preserving that open space adjacent to the urban environment and looking at that. The Zurich example, which is, again, mandatory. So we talked about incentive-based versus mandatory approaches That's a mandatory approach. We're actually seeing more of that. A lot of examples and images of the green roofs are coming from Switzerland with these approaches, but they're requiring a green roof on all flat surfaces. So that's an interesting example as well. We'll also have examples of incentive-based programs for green infrastructure on this list, and then also inclusion of parks and more general open space within the built environment in places like Barcelona. So there's, a wide range of things that are going from kind of the small scale that could be more focused on, stormwater, but also the sequestering environment to the larger scale examples, as you see here in this international list of sequestration options. On the next slide, we'll see some national examples. First, we'll see the images that I mentioned from Switzerland, so you can see just visually the difference in these flat roofs being converted to green roofs. And again, that responds to, stormwater runoff and heating and cooling of the building, as well as preserving some sequestering environment within the urban context. On the next slide, we'll see some U.S. examples of, again, you can see some parallels right from the international to the U.S. examples just by what they're doing, and this is non-intentional. This is just what comes up. We see, green roof programs in the U.S. And stormwater management, green infrastructure programs, as well as, like the example from Pennsylvania, something in comparison to the Australia example that's specifically focused on open space. We see the tool of, cluster development being used where you're clustering development on one part of the land, maintaining the density, but leaving the rest as open space in the areas where we're looking for more conservation. And that also is an important point because we're, so focused on cities and development in urban areas where, more suburban, rural areas are saying, well, how do we, adapt that to our areas? And cluster development would be where you're increasing densities, you're moving it closer to transit or downtown or infrastructure, and then preserving the land versus building out and spreading across the landscape as you're developing, in those areas. So there's some tools that address those as well if you kind of go through the list here. So on the next slide, you'll see we'll end with just a quick overview of renewable energy. So renewable energy is energy that can be naturally replenished, running the gamut of solar energy, wind, geothermal, hydropower. In this examples, I'm mostly going to focus on solar just because that's where we're seeing kind of, I think, the most activity that's relevant to what's happening at the local level. Switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy can provide significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and indirectly conserve land by mitigating climate change. But given that, it's still important that, development of large-scale renewable energy projects can risk what some people are calling energy sprawl. So it's kind of another type of sprawl that we're seeing that, has these competing, priorities and benefits that, we need to be aware of and address. And so citing these properties to safeguard to avoid compromising wildlife habitat and other valuable open spaces or agricultural lands with prime soils is really important to balance and look at that and not just look at kind of citing renewable energies with, in isolation just for its climate change mitigation benefits. There's still, there's, explicit energy examples, although there are less examples, generally speaking, from communities in this area. Probably see a long list on the international side. But a lot of it then relate back to our green programs, so there's some overlap there. But just from a planning standpoint, very few communities have specific renewable energy plans. And so, where to start and decide and make decisions here, it can be incorporated into more general plans or do specific functional plans related to that. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see that a lot of what we're seeing in an international context relates to mandates for solar hot water. It seems to be a very popular area of activity, or, small solar requirements or tax credits or incentive-based programs, I think seem to be kind of the most likely thing to see. We do see an example there from Germany of a solar master plan. So as I said, we don't see a lot of planning language related to renewables. I think we're going to see a shift and change in that the American Planning Association recently developed a Planning for Solar Guide. We've created one for the state of New York. So there's a lot more resources out there that talk about how to incorporate renewables into your land use plans to start to address these issues. If we look at the national example list on the next slide, you'll see that, the range of examples, again, could be, regulations that relate to mandate incentivizing small-scale energy within, the built environment, so a similar parallel to kind of what we were seeing on the sequestering side. But then also there are a lot of communities that are addressing this issue of the energy sprawl and where to site solar energy in their communities, either through planning, or in the case when they have the authority, depending on the scale of the project, to actually define the appropriate districts and restrictions. And, as I'm presenting, there's a dialogue going back and forth about ground-mounted solar on the Connecticut planning listserv, trying to figure out, well, what can we do? Would we allow this? Who's doing what in which community? We actually recently did a survey of all Connecticut municipalities to see who's addressing solar and how they're addressing it. And for the most part, it's really, pretty minimally included in the local regulations, and very few communities are addressing the larger scale projects, in that way. So, there are models. I helped to write the model for New York State. Massachusetts has a great model that does talk about the full range of zoning for solar. It talks about, ways to streamline the small-scale projects and address any land use impacts there, and then ways to address larger-scale projects and how to appropriately zone for those as well. So again, we're seeing kind of a mixture of options here that go from the smaller scale to the larger scale, types of development that are appropriate more in the built environment versus those that will likely be sited in more of the open space outlying areas. And so again, local governments are playing a significant role in decisions they make about where and how these various types of projects are sited will have a significant impact on the ability to address climate change in the state of Connecticut. And so again, if we kind of look back from the beginning, international context is recognizing the role of local governments, the importance of local governments in addressing climate change, and that they've really been a laboratory in the United States for a long time, and we see also in other countries in experimenting with different approaches of addressing climate change in all these different buckets that have significant impacts to emissions related to transportation and buildings, maintaining our sequestering environment, but also helping to transition to renewable energy sources. And so, we can have a lot of goals adopted through international agreements or even state goals, but without the support and understanding and opportunity at the local level, a lot of those, goals will not be able to be met. And so it's important, and we're actually seeing this play out an example in another state where there is a renewable energy goal. It's not a mandate to local governments, but at the end of the day, many of the projects will have to be approved by local governments. And when they decide to adopt a moratorium or have concerns about the land use impacts or local concerns, meeting those state renewable goals is going to be problematic. So it's important to, address these issues with local governments through, a engaged process. And so to avoid those types of issues, when you kind of talk about new types of development or new direction and settlement or innovating at the local level, you often can get pushback. So if you look at the next slide, I'll just remind you of Josh's slide about pushback. So first, there's local politics. People are very passionate about what happens at the local level. So building the human infrastructure, engaging at the local level is hugely important. It's not just having these examples, but it's also building that human infrastructure and avoiding the types of signs that you'll see on the next slide that Josh showed us earlier. And then you can keep clicking, they keep adding, excuse the bad language there. So all the different signs that you often see when you maybe propose new things, to transitioning to signs like this. Yes, in my backyard, things are fine. When we all love to show up to a community meeting or local legislative body meeting and have people outside or coming in with signs that say, things are fine, no complaints here. So to get there, there is a huge engagement education process. It's not easy. There's a lot of tools out there and things that are happening across the country and even, in other countries as we saw. But it's really important that local governments, continue to innovate and serve as, actors, especially in this land use context where there's so much opportunity from a climate change standpoint. So that's the end of the comments that I have. I know we have some time left to address questions. So I'll turn it back to Carrie. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Josh and Jessica. That was really wonderful. A lot of really helpful things to follow up on and look for in the examples that you put up there. So we do have some questions, and for folks who have additional questions, go ahead and start sending them in. I'll start with the ones that we have. So our first question, are transition towns catching on in the U.S.? Totnes in the U.K. was the first, and I think New Haven is also one. Are you familiar with, to be honest, I don't know what a transition town is, so I'm hoping one of you do.
Yeah, I've not, however, I don't know if they can add to that. I have not heard that, category. If they want to add more detail there, I can try to respond. I don't know, Josh, if you have.
Well, I don't have much to add either. I mean, I think the answer is probably no. It's the concept of transition town, as I understand it, is sort of a grassroots community effort that aims to make a town more sort of independently sufficient and reducing the impact of environmental problems, particularly climate and energy-related problems. And I think that it's happening in a sense, but I think the banner of transition towns is a little bit more of a European banner, but I could be wrong about that. But I don't have any good examples, unfortunately.
Okay. So next question. So with the TOD, is there evidence of gentrification in TOD communities? And if so, what are some of the solutions?
This is Jessica, I can answer that. There's definitely been evidence and concerns of gentrification. As I mentioned, the study that came out of Smart Growth showed that the premium significantly increased in these types of TOD projects. So the land prices or rental premiums went up. We all see what's happening in places like San Francisco, where prices are going up because of the drive in demand and therefore building, but then the result is potentially gentrification. So it is a real risk and concern. I would just respond to two things. One of the things they highlighted in the Smart Growth study was that oftentimes TODs themselves are more affordable in the sense that you don't need multiple vehicles, that they're smaller units, so they're less expensive to heat and cool. However, if they have high housing premiums, those types of just general lower cost baselines don't fully help for people that are in the much lower income brackets. And so in that case, we've seen lots of municipalities adopt inclusionary zoning laws, that when you have developments that you have the requirement to include affordable housing in that new development. The specific requirements that are really important there is not just inclusion, but we see in a lot of these housing settlements, such as one coming out of Westchester, that you also affirmatively market. So you don't just result with a mixture of diversity of incomes, it's also actual ethnic, racial diversity results as well. So the affirmative action piece, I think, based on some of the settlements and lawsuits that have arisen regarding, gentrification in some areas, have helped to inform when you're trying to do more inclusive development that you also have that piece. I think it's also important that when you have inclusionary zoning, that zoning is very specific about, that the housing needs to be of the same quality, that it should be dispersed, it doesn't create a stigma. There's certain standards and best practices in developing those types of laws that are really important. Whether you allow the developer to pay into a fund to develop affordable housing or require that the sites be part of the project are all local questions, but all within that kind of box of how to respond to that particular issue. That's helpful.
Okay, great. Sorry, are you still answering the question?
I was just going to add there's a lot of resources out there and information on that. So if anybody has follow-up questions, they're welcome to email me. I'd be happy to direct them to resources on any of these topics.
Great. Okay, so next question. Do you have additional thoughts on whether urban growth boundaries can be effective or if it leads to more unintended consequences?
Yeah.
Jessica, I don't. I love the idea and concept, but no, they haven't been applied widely. So I'm probably not the right person to answer that question.
Yeah. You know, we have from our Western states, the best examples of urban growth boundaries and the use of that in the development patterns and controlling it. Something in the casebooks that we use as an example in directing growth and how to do it. I know there has been a lot of criticism about whether it's actually working. So I think, like Josh said, the concept is really good. I think there have been successes and positive outcomes, but I do know that some of the risks are the impact on property values and properties right on the other side and gentrification and things like that. So, the concept makes sense. It's also complicated in areas where you don't have that type of top-down regional, political will. So even if you're looking to do something similar, in other parts of the country, it may be problematic to try to implement something like that without that regional balance of here's where we're building, here's where we're preserving. But in concept, it's a great way to kind of achieve, I think, a lot of the things that I was highlighting. But does have these other outcomes that are harder to work through. So like everything, nothing's easy, right? So.
And I guess I will add one thing, which is that Jessica, a lot of the things you mentioned to to deal with the problems of affordability and TODs, those same sorts of tools are available if an urban growth boundary is something that an urban area wants to consider. It may have negative consequences in the ways that it has been implemented so far. That doesn't mean that those consequences can't be addressed through other creative techniques.
Right. Good point.
Okay, another question. How is stormwater management connected to climate change?
Well, I can start with that one. I don't have a lot of information on the technical side, but the general answer is that stormwater management, obviously, what it does now, which is getting water that comes down in a storm out of the urban areas and gets it safely and both safely and in an environmentally friendly way into treatment plants or into water bodies. It's that same problem, but amplified under climate change. So what we're looking at is more intense storms, more frequent storms that will cover the impervious surfaces that are common in suburban and urban areas and pick up pollutants and so forth, and then rush them both through flooding, which is a risk and obviously an economic and health and safety problem, and then also the environmental contaminants that they might pick up and then take to water bodies, nearby water bodies. So, the process here is to figure out how do we account for the additional and faster storms that will be upon us when and as climate change gets worse. The problem is both the quantity of the water that comes down and the fact that it can come down in a faster period of time, so that there's not an opportunity for it to absorb into what pervious surfaces do remain. So additional rain gardens, catchment basins, and things like this, which can absorb more water, basically make up for what not make up is not the right word, but mitigate a bit the amount of impervious surfaces that already exist. This is something that cities and towns around Connecticut are definitely already working on. I know New Haven has been doing it, and Bridgeport has been doing it, and I'm sure others. And this is just a problem that is not different in kind from what we already have, but is different in quantity from what we already have.
Great, thank you. So we're on our last question, unless someone wants to write one in real quick. But With this question, they're asking, and I don't know if you have the answer to this, but what towns in Connecticut have a sustainability or energy plan in place, if any? I don't know if you know of a few or if any.
I do know, just because I'm based in New Haven and have some of my students have worked in Bridgeport, that both Bridgeport and New Haven have sustainability plans. Bridgeport's 2020 vision in particular stands out, although I don't know with the change of administrations there what will become of that. But beyond those two, I'm sure there are others, but I don't know.
I think West Hartford and several clean energy community towns have something along those lines. So folks, if you're interested in learning about what towns are doing around energy issues, I encourage you to go to the Clean Energy Communities website. So that's all the questions that I have. So thank you again so much for your participation and your answering all the questions. There's a lot of really valuable information as we start to tackle land use issues here in Connecticut. If you don't mind people contacting you, we can post the slides with your contact information for follow-up questions.
That'd be great.
Yeah, it's okay with me.
Great, so we'll get those on the website in the next couple of days. So just before we sign off, I just want to announce that the next webinar in our series is going to be October 3rd, I think. Oh, October 6th, sorry. October 6th with Nick Nigro, founder of Atlas Public Policy. He'll be talking about an alternative fuel vehicle study that he recently completed for the Connecticut Green Bank. So to learn more about opportunities for alternative fuels deployment here in Connecticut, I encourage you to tune into that webinar. We'll be sending out announcements shortly. Great, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for tuning in.
Thank you very much, Carrie.
Thank you.